Good morning and welcome to another session or another episode of Fire 5 at Phoenix. So I'm Zoe Thompson. I'm from Phoenix Life and Wellbeing Coaching. And if you are joining us live, we are live and joined this morning by Martin Preston. Martin's going to tell us a little bit about himself in just a second. If you haven't tuned into any of these before, I am joined by a guest each week. And each guest brings with them 5 questions. So Martin has brought with him 5 questions this morning, but I haven't seen the questions. So any answers and the conversation that happens this morning is all live, completely interactive and completely unplanned. So each month we have a topic, and our topic this month for December is reflection and review. But we're going to look at it. We're going to look at goals and what we want to achieve, but from the sort of angle of reflection and review. So that's going to be the topic of conversation this morning. So before we get into the questions, Martin, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what your business is?
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm really looking forward to it, and I don't think the questions are too hard, but we'll see. So yeah, thank you. So I'm a sport and business consultant. And essentially I help organizational teams move through change successfully and also improve their impact. So a lot of that is, as I say, my background in sport connects to high performing teams, and high performing business teams equals high performing businesses. But particularly now, businesses are having to go through a huge amount of change, and that's either growth or they're having to make some really difficult decisions. That can be pretty hard on everybody, the leader, but also the rest of the team. You've got a real balance between logic and emotion in all of that. And I quite often get called in to help, business leaders navigate that and also help their teams on the journey, whether they're starting in a challenging position or actually they're already in good shape, but the leader thinks they can achieve more. They're just not sure how to unlock it. So, change and improvement performance and greater impact and business growth. That's what I'm working on at the moment.
And I love the connection with sport as well. And I know your history with sport as well. But I know when we first connected, it was something that we both had in common in using what we've both learned through sport, but also transferring into businesses, and for me, helping people transfer that into their sort of more personal goals, but in particular sort of the health and well-being side of it. But I think it's great that we both come from different sports backgrounds, but I love that we've both kind of transferred similar principles over into what we do, but in slightly different ways.
Yeah, and I find that people get it. So it could be a digital company or a networking, or it could be any sector. But as soon as you start asking them questions about what are the characteristics that high performing team has, in sport, but also what are the characteristics each of those individuals have? How do you blend all of those individuals into something that's really cohesive? People get it. It doesn't matter what sector they're in or what business they're in. So I just think there's a huge transfer there, but also across, what other sectors are doing, which sport can learn from too. It's constant evolution. So I love working in sport, but also out of sport as well, just that variety. But it's all people. It's all about helping people adapt and helping people succeed, which we've both, got in common.
Yeah. And I think it doesn't matter. I think it helps, doesn't it, when you take people out of talking about their business or out of talking about themselves and talking about it from a different perspective of looking at what makes other people successful, and then looking at how they can mirror that and transfer that into their own lives or their own businesses. I think it's a great way to explore those options, isn't it? Without it takes the personal element out, doesn't it? So it's talking about the same thing from a different perspective, and I think it's a great idea to be able to do that.
Yeah, and what you do is you unlock new opportunities, don't you? So there's a lot for us to be inspired by, and other people to learn from. But you can't just take something off the shelf, that someone else has done and say, I'm going to do that. You've got to make it personal. Everyone's unique. Every business team is unique. So it's going through that process of, authentic success and making it personal to the individual, but also the group as well. And you can't sort of fast track that. You can help. You'll help your clients. I think I help accelerate my clients through change, and sort of understand how they can achieve more quickly, and sort of keep it simple. But you can't fast track it. You can't just take what someone else has done and just try and replicate it, because it just won't work.
No, I think it's modeling that excellence, but modeling it in a way that makes it work for you and in the way that you need it to work, doesn't it? So
yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. So I'm really intrigued as to what questions you brought. You've promised me they're not difficult. We'll wait and see. do you want to go ahead with the first question?
Yeah, so I mean, we've just been touching on change and how people can unlock new opportunities, but we've all had to adapt, haven't we? Since lockdown, COVID kicked in middle of March, I think. I was traveling a lot before then, and I've hardly been anywhere since. Which has taken a bit for me to adapt to. So I guess we're talking today about reflection and reviewing our goals. Something we've all had to do is review our goals. What impact did COVID and has COVID had on the goals that you set yourself this year?
Oh, okay. I think I've been very fortunate in that so if I start with business first, I think I've been very fortunate in that I set up the business a couple of years ago, and I set it up online from day one, and for two reasons mainly. Firstly was that I didn't want to be restricted by excuse me, only being able to coach people that were local to where I was living. So I wanted to increase the opportunity of being able to work with a real variety of people. But also the second option was more of a personal reason, was that I would like to travel. So I have never done the traveling thing in a gap year or anything like that. I've done holidays, but it's always been on my list of wanting to be able to travel. So originally I set up the business online so that I could travel and work. So the benefit of that has been that I didn't have to make too many changes when the first lockdown came in. I was already online, everything was set up online. And actually the majority of people who I was working with were online as well. So there wasn't a huge change for them. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to travel. So I was supposed to be going away and working away, which hasn't happened, but it will happen eventually. From a personal perspective, there's things that I really enjoy doing when I'm not working that I haven't been able to do, so I've had to adapt around that. But from a personal goals perspective, for me, my main goal this year was to really get that balance between work and not working. You know what it's like when you love what you do. It's really hard for it to feel like work sometimes. So a lot of the things that I'd written in this year was getting away once a month, going to the cinema at least once a month, catching up with friends and family more often, being able to do more things with my nephew and nieces and my son. And so a lot of those things haven't been able to happen. But yeah, my personal goal this year was more about spending more time on me and with people who are really important. And basketball, I haven't been able to do that as well. So, there's lots of things that I think I've spent a long time over the last couple of years with, competing and things like that, with sort of really strict personal goals or quite high achieving personal goals. And so now it's just kind of easing off on that a little bit, and just my personal goals are more slowing down, which is not most people's personal goals, but it's something that I wanted to really focus on in just getting that balance right. How has it been? How has it been for you?
Yeah, well, I'm sort of I had a business plan, and I had quite a few projects lined up that were put on hold, and then some projects just came out of nowhere. I didn't expect them or see them coming. So there's been a real sort of balance between, I guess, reaction to uncertainty but also reacting to new opportunities. And even though I had a sort of a headline goal, which was to continue to sort of move forward with the business, it's not happened how I thought it was going to happen. I've had to adapt to it. I think the interesting thing that you sort of touched on in a couple of different ways really was some of your goals this year were things that you wanted to do, things that you enjoy beyond the business. And then you've also, you sort of said slow down, but I'd probably say maybe just a bit of a different balance to. So I think the key thing that came through for me for there, and it's something important to me, is what keeps me at my best. I go running, I go out, I love being outside. It doesn't matter what the weather is. Exercise, pottering around in the garden. I'm sort of lucky to be able to do that, and catching up with people. So I guess when we're sort of reviewing our goals, we shouldn't forget, what creates the sort of circumstances for us to be our best.
Yeah. And I think, like you were saying about how you've adapted your approach to still meet the goals, but not necessarily in the way that you were expecting to or had planned to, but you've adapted how you can do that within the restrictions or new boundaries that we've got. And I've done I've done the same. I've still protected that time out. I've just taken time out in a slightly different way. So when we were allowed into the cinema, I've gone to the cinema. If the gyms have been closed, I've gone for walks, or set up something a little bit different. When we've been able to have socially distanced walks, I've still met up with friends and family. So it has. I think on reflection, I think it has been achieved. I think the balance has been good. It's just not been like you with your business. It's just not been in the way that I had kind of mapped out and planned.
Yeah, and I go to the gym. I work at the gym, so when the gym's shut, I've been working at home. So I get up in the morning, have my breakfast and a coffee, and then come into my the spare room where I'm working. And it's a little bit like Groundhog Day. So there's something about how we adapt to that. I mean, one of the things I was really interested in is, and we've sort of almost started to talk about this, is how we each react, to situations like this. And some people are quite strategic. They need something really fixed to aim for, whereas some people like variety. They like being kept on their toes, and they like new opportunities, sort of either looking for them or following up on them. So how, if we had a set of goals and then we need to review them quite regularly, COVID changing, how do you review your goals, but when there's still so much uncertainty?
So I love variety. I love the unexpected. I love the uncertain. I actually find planning ahead and planning long-term a real challenge. And I know it's different for different people. So I don't know that you can see it in this shot, but I have a wall of Post-it notes, but it's only ever 3 months ahead. So I have a bigger picture of what the next 12 months will look like, but I only plan in detail three months ahead, which for me gives lots of room for adaptation and change as things come up. But I think that's partly my background of working in the police, is that you were dealing with the unexpected all of the time, and so you had to plan a certain level, but you always had to make room for the unexpected. So although you couldn't plan what the unexpected was going to be, you knew that the unexpected was going to happen. So you planned for it, even though you didn't know what it was going to be or what it was going to look like. And I think that's probably what comes through in coaching now, is helping people to work through that, helping people to work through, we know that life will throw things at us that we're not expecting, but we can expect and almost make room for that to happen. So when I'm helping people with making their plans for their goals, it's making sure there's enough flexibility in there for the unexpected to happen, but for them to still be able to show up and still keep on that plan of progress. So I think what a lot of people do is plan almost like 100%, and then that's very hard to maintain or sustain when the unexpected happens. But if you plan in for the unexpected, you can show up for 75% every day, and on the days where you don't need anything else or nothing else happens, you can give it an extra 25%, but you can always show up for 75%. And I think 75% every day is always the consistency, and having sustainable plan of action is, in my experience and my experience with people that I've worked with, shows more success than people who try and go like bang at it, and then the minute something happens that's not expected, it knocks them off, and then they find it really hard to get back into that routine again. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it's just making me think of conversations we've had before about VUCA.
Yes.
Volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous, which is a really sort of complex way of saying things blooming change, and you can't you can't predict everything. But the the answer to that is to plan, but to build in the opportunity to sort of review what's going on regularly, and then you give yourself the chance to adapt. But I think it's also, a challenge for some people is having the ability to sort of be creative and and to adapt.
Yeah.
So, just building on this question a little bit, I mean, for people that want real sort of concrete, they want to have a plan and be able to stick to it, what advice would you give them? They're needing to change their goals and review their goals regularly when it's so uncertain.
So I'd always encourage people to, at least every week, with the aim of at the end of every week to look back, what worked well, what didn't work well. Start to look for patterns of success, patterns that okay, that's now the third week I've been able to show up and do that. So that you can start to repeat that, and then look at the areas where the areas that haven't worked so well, so you can start to flex and try something different the following week. I think what does keep coming up is that a lot of people just try to repeat the same thing. They'll just go at it a little bit harder and hope that the outcome will be different. And I think what a lot of people benefit from is actually sitting back, looking at the bigger picture and thinking, okay, that didn't work. What can I try differently for a different outcome? And I think it is that regular reflection and review, as well as the planning ahead. You need both, because a lot of people plan ahead, but they plan ahead based on repetition, not necessarily based on what has worked and then trying something different for what hasn't. So I think you said about people who want that sort of very clear plan of what they're doing. I think you can plan ahead for the week. Excuse me. You can plan in a certain level of unexpected things that may or may not happen. Certainly a week ahead, most people have got a bit of an indication of what may or may not come up. But that reflection and review is a really important part of that. And I think that's the bit that drops off, and people just end up, it's that repetition, and they just keep trying the same things. They might try a little bit harder, but the outcome is still the same. But unfortunately, then what happens is you've put more effort and energy into something that isn't going to work. And so the failure feels a lot more, because you've put more energy and effort into it. So the fail feels, that's hard to say, isn't it? The failure feels a lot more impactful because you've put more into it. Whereas sometimes taking that step back and trying something different doesn't require any more energy and effort. And so then you can then start to flex with what is working until you have a model that works for you most of the time. You can't have all of the time, but you're aiming for most of the time, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, it's a really good point that the more you push, the more you're putting into solving the problem. In a way, the more you've got to lose. I mean, one of the things I always think is really useful, particularly talking about reviewing and reflecting, today, but is sometimes getting a different perspective. We're all pretty strong on certain things, so we use those things all the time because they sort of normally give us success. Sometimes they're not; those aren't the right strengths, for the problem. So, getting a different perspective. If you're quite an emotional person, actually speaking to the most logical person you know, or vice versa. When you've got a challenge or something's changed. I know a couple of people who, run a business. One's really strategic and the other one is incredibly creative and opportunistic. And when COVID hit, their reaction to the situation was completely different. One was suddenly stumped because it was, how do I plan strategically now?
Yeah.
Whereas the other said, God, this is amazing. We've got to adapt. How exciting. So, but between them, they can bring a real balance in terms of that planning, but also that flexibility, and opportunism. So, it's one of the things I always say, and I guess, we both contribute in that way, is giving people a different perspective. And, we're sort of not necessarily pulled into the emotion, which means that we can probably contribute a dose of logic, I guess.
And it's interesting because we've been looking at I have to pronounce this correctly, the Cynefin model framework as part of the coaching course at the moment, which looks at the VUCA element. And it's interesting for me in terms of reflecting now on my years in the police. There were lots of elements of police work that are the same. So it's repetition of good practice, best practice. There's lots of elements that fit into the framework of it looks like this, but you might need to adapt different approaches dependent on the situation. And then you've got those from the other side, you've got the elements of the work that is completely unexpected, that you need to make a decision and then reflect and keep making different decisions and practice something new. So it's really interesting that I think that's probably what's taught me to be able to be both sides, of being able to work within a framework of best practice and policies and procedures and legislation that's very strict, but the creativity element of thinking on your feet and being able to approach things in different ways, it gifted me with learning both elements. And so that's the great thing now of being able to still do both, just at a slightly slower pace through coaching. And it's interesting that I use the same framework. I did a workshop for the basketball team, and we used VUCA and the framework to look at, what do they know in a basketball game, where they can, it's a certain, this is going to happen. In any game, this is going to happen. Where the best practice is of the things that you've learned in training that you can repeat over and over. There'll be certain things in the game where you have an idea of what will work, and your coach will give you direction of what works best in that situation. But then there's also a whole element of uncertain things that will happen in the game that you have to react and respond to. So VUCA's really fascinating for me to see how it can be applied in lots of different ways. So although the framework and the methodologies behind it are new to me, I've been working with it for years. I just didn't know that it had a name, which is always the great thing about learning new things, isn't it? Of knowing that you've known it for years, you just didn't know that it was a thing.
Yeah, and it sort of gives us a common language, doesn't it? So the basketball team now will sort of understand VUCA, and the thing for me was that the world was becoming more VUCA anyway, but COVID has just really shone a light on that, even though some people did predict that there was going to be viruses like this and what could happen across the world. But a word we've sort of both touched on but not sort of discussed yet is reflection. So it's a word that's common to everybody really, and in sport, and certainly some of my colleagues and ex-colleagues that are coaches, spending actually more and more time looking at reflective practice. So I guess when we say reflection, or we use the word reflection, we've all got a different perspective of what that is and reflective practice is. What is it to you? What does it mean to you? Why is it important to you? That's three questions, but they're one really.
So I know reflection, I think especially in coaching, reflection is so important. And I, as a coach in sessions, it's that quite often, and you'll be the same in the work that you do, it's that reflective inquiry of listening to what people are saying and then helping play it back to them with some questions in that help them to reflect on their perception and then to reflect on their situation from different perspectives. So reflection comes through in coaching sessions a lot, in talking about how they reflect on what's happening in their world at the moment and how they can reflect on it from different perspectives, and where that might create opportunities of maybe approaching things very differently. So in coaching, it happens all the time. From a personal perspective, from the business perspective, at the end of each month, I reflect on the work that I've done. I reflect on what's worked well from a business model point of view, but I also reflect on the work that I've enjoyed most, to try and make sure that I have more of that in the pipeline. But also when things haven't worked, I take time to reflect on why that might not have worked, what I might do differently next time. But there's lots of reflection in what I do. After coaching sessions, I'll sit and reflect on how I think the session went, what I might want to what I might want to bring up in another session that I think might be helpful. There's always lots of reflection going on, but I'm quite an active reflector. I'll write things down. I'm not excuse me I'm not somebody who I don't do a lot of meditation. Don't do a lot of meditation or that just sitting and thinking. I'm an active thinker, so I'll have post-it notes, notebooks, scribble things down, diagrams. So I'm much more of an active reflector, but there's lots of reflection going on, and not always sort of a conscious reflection, like a structured reflection. Most of the time it is, and sometimes it's just, when you go for a walk, isn't it? You go for a walk and you start thinking about things that are going on, and you reflect on them, and you think you get that space to sit or walk and think things through.
Yeah, and that I've got sort of a follow-on question around reflection. So I guess, I'm very similar to you. I sort of reflect pockets of moments. There's also times that I create, and I don't have a sort of an agenda for those moments, but I know that I would just naturally reflect. So that might be when I go running, or go for a walk, or just when I'm pottering around, or lying in the bath. I know that I will automatically reflect. So I don't sort of feel I need any structure to it and make it very deliberate, because I think I'll do it anyway. But for those that might need some structure, have you got any tips in terms of how they can, build more reflective practice into their sort of schedule and what they do?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's something that's come up a couple of times quite recently, actually. In particular for people who have a tendency to overthink. We've been working through different ways where they can have a more structured reflection to prevent the overthinking. So whether it's a work-based scenario of coming home at the end of the day and worrying about a conversation that's happened, or whether it is, an athlete who's performing and then coming home and thinking through how they've performed. If you have a tendency to overthink, and I think overthinking is quite often a reflection of an absence of information. So you tend to try and think of all of the different alternatives or all of the different perspectives. So sometimes having that structure in place can help. It puts a boundary in place of or parameters of how to think things through. So the things that have come up for a lot of people is the ones that I mentioned before, that what did work well, how did it feel, but also what didn't work well, and what would you do differently next time. And I think quite often, if it's not structured thinking, for a lot of people, they'll go through what didn't go well, and then they'll play it over and over and over again. they don't necessarily balance it out with what did go well, and they won't necessarily think through how they might do it differently next time, which I think is probably the most important element of that. Because if you sit and think things through and think, okay, if that situation was to happen again, what could I do differently that might have a different outcome? You're thinking it through so that the next time it happens, you've already given it some thought, and that response is sitting in your memory there somewhere to be able to use. And I think we're very quick to reflect or be quite dismissive when something hasn't, we're very good at giving ourselves a bit of a telling off, aren't we, when something hasn't gone to plan or something didn't go well, but we don't give the same energy to thinking about what we might do differently. The other questions that I think are really good. So there's a book by Paul McGee called Sumo, Shut Up and Move On. And he has seven questions for reflection, which include things like how big is this? How big a problem is this? How big a problem will this be in a couple of months' time? How much energy are you giving it? Is that in balance with how big the problem is? And is it a rational response, or is it more of an emotional response? And then he asks the questions of, what would you do differently next time? How would you approach it in a different way next time? So I think those are really good questions to have. And I think the other one is just more around what did they do well that they want to make sure they repeat again? Because I think that's the other challenge. It's the other reason why I encourage people at the end of the day to think about their wins and their successes of the day, because it's very easy, isn't it, at the end of the day to think about all of the things that didn't go well, whereas actually sitting in bed and just recalling 3 things that have gone well that day can really help. So I think just for having some structure in your reflection can help keep it of a more rational overview, a more balanced overview. It helps you to look at different perspectives. So, maybe the question might be, okay, this is how I think it went, but how might somebody else have observed it, or how might somebody else have thought it's gone? But so it helps with helps you to rationalize it. It helps different perspectives. But I think it also just puts that boundary in that prevents the overthinking and that constant churn of giving yourself a hard time over something that you can't change quite often. You can't go back and do anything about it, but also giving yourself that structure to think about how you can do it differently the next time.
Yeah, and I think that overthinking, because some people do have a sort of obsessive nature. Some people are more pragmatic. Again, our emotions can sort of, sway us to one side of that or the other. I mean, I quite often think, and in business, particularly sort of technology and, science, they, I guess the question every time they test something and try something is, what have I learned? What have we learned? And sports stars, every time they try something and get better at something, whether it's psychologically or, physically or technically, it's all focused on learning. What have we learned? What, like you said, what could we do better, do differently to get actually the most impact from this, and almost most impact from the less energy. So, yeah, absolutely not overthinking, but, I also think, what have we learned from this? What have I learned from this? How do I take that forward is a good focus as well. So we've sort of touched on processes, and we keep coming back to sort of us as individuals. And I guess there are so many sort of pressures on all of us, or, you could call it interference, or you could call it considerations. So when we're reviewing our goals and when we're reflecting as part of that, how do we make sure that actually the decisions we make are really, authentic, based on us and what we need and what we're trying to do, rather than maybe other people's expectations or what we think we're supposed to be doing or trying to achieve?
I think that's really tough. I think that's something that's tough for a lot of people. I think values is what's coming to my mind, knowing what your own values are, knowing what your purpose is, knowing what your direction is. knowing what your goals are. I think that there's a lot. I think the difference probably when people sit down and reflect on all of that, on what it is for them, it helps make those decisions, doesn't it? Because if you don't have that worked out for you, you don't have anything to compare it to. So when an opportunity comes up or a decision comes up, if you don't have the clarity on your values, your needs, your purpose, your goals, your direction, it makes it a lot easier to be swayed in different directions because you don't have something to compare it to. So you have something on the table, but how do you compare it with, is this in alignment with what's important to me? Is this in alignment with where I want to go, where I'm heading? Is it going to take me off on a different path that's going to take me away from where I want to go? So it's really important to know what that is. And I think that's, it's that living at cause rather than living in effect. You're almost waiting for decisions to be made for you. You're waiting for other people to make those decisions, or life makes those decisions and puts you on a path rather than you making a decision of what path you want to take, which is that living in effect of, this is what I want. I am going to take control of the things I can take control of. Now I am going to be very conscious of what direction I want to head in and ask myself, will this take me closer to where I want to get to? Is this in alignment with what's important to me? Will this bring me fulfillment and happiness, or is this going to bring other people fulfillment and happiness? And is it in line with somebody else's goals? Am I going to end up, contributing to somebody else's goals and not to mine? So I think that clarity is so important to help make those decisions and to help have that focus.
Guess what? I completely agree. So and the interesting thing is, because I guess, you very much, I think, coach individuals. I sort of help leaders and individuals, but quite often that's part of a business team. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly the same, so businesses do it. They think about their vision, their mission, their purpose. They think about what they're good at, and they think about what type of what's the impact they want to have.
Yeah.
And they think about, well, how do we bring that to life then? Mm-hmm. And it's not always easy. And I've sort of spoken to quite a few people, I'm sure you have, that were been at risk of redundancy, or maybe unfortunately been made redundant. And when we're thinking about the goals we had, reviewing them, reflection, take the emotion out of that. Emotions, because it tells us what's important to us, but after that, it's, in a way, it's not very useful at all. And you want to be able to sort of think through things logically. So and I think one of the key things you said there was that if you don't know what direction you're traveling in, and that's not really authentic and really grounded in you, what direction are you traveling in? You can be swayed by something that happens one day, something that happens the next day. Some people call it their North Star. Simon Sinek, it's all around the why, but I would add, well, then the how. And sometimes I've spoken to some people, actually they're very successful, and I'd sort of ask them a set of questions, what's important, what are you passionate about, what impact you want to have, what you're good at, and actually are you using that stuff to give yourself direction? And they almost go, I've never even thought about those questions. And what's interesting about that is, well, what are you doing then? You're, like you said, you're almost sort of waiting, and you're drifting, probably a bit like a leaf in a stream that's going with the current, rather than having real direction, which I think then makes decision making and problem solving and adapting a hell of a lot easier, because like you can say, well, is this going to keep me on my path or not? It doesn't mean you can't deviate at different moments. Some people at the moment might need to be taking a job or a different job, but they can probably use that to get back on the track they wanted to, rather than feel like I'm completely off direction.
But you can go off path and your focus still be knowing that although you were on this route, you're going to go round and come back and join it, and your direction and focus is still in the same way. And I think the the business knowing what all of those are is really important, because when you're recruiting people, that's what drives your culture. You want to be recruiting people who have a similar ethos, who have a similar, values, because that's what builds, as your company grows, that's what helps you to hold on to that culture, that you create when you start your business, of the direction that you want to take, and the mission, vision and values that you have as an organization should be right from the start in recruitment, of bringing people in. I think what happens a lot of the time is that they bring people in and then try and remold those individuals to have the shared values, which doesn't always happen. So what you want to do is recruit and bring in people and give them that space then to be authentic and bring that diversity into your organization, but knowing that ultimately their purpose and values are in line with what you want as an organization. But then that gives them the freedom to be their authentic selves, knowing that values, purpose, vision is shared. And I think that's part of the problem. We're probably going off subject here a little bit, but in terms of diversity and inclusion, is that companies bring people in, but then try and mold them to all look like, behave like their board of directors, and that's not what you want. You want people to come in and be their authentic selves, bring all of this creativity and all of what they bring to the table, knowing that you've got the shared values at core and knowing that you're all working in the same direction. And I think that's I guess even for me, working with individuals, helping people to understand what needs are important to them also helps them to understand how other people have different needs and how they might show up in a different way. So this week alone, I've had a conversation with somebody, and we worked out that one of her needs is structure. And when we started to reflect on what her working week is like, her days that are more uncomfortable and that she finds more of a challenge is when they lack structure. But knowing that now, we can work ahead and work that in. But when you've got a team of people, some people will want structure, somebody else is going to want flexibility, and some people want to reflect and take lots of time planning, and other people just want to crack on and get on with it. And when you understand who's in your team and what their needs are, that helps you bring everybody in for that high performing team, doesn't it? So whilst I work with individuals, helping them to understand what theirs are, it does help them. For those that are managers, it helps them with their teams at work, but it also helps with family life, understanding partners and children, but also for your world, I guess that's how it works in you bringing everybody together as a team to work that out together.
Yeah, and it's all the same stuff, so whether it's an individual or a group of people. So when I work with a team, I'm working with the individuals within the team, to discover what they need to be their very best. And then the team conversation is, how do you blend all of that, and how do you help all those individuals become cohesive? And it's the same as individuals. We've touched on, how do we sort of create an environment to be our very best. We're all different. Some people need structure, some people like complete flexibility. I'm one of those.
I like chaos.
I absolutely sort of value frameworks when I'm working with an organization or on a project. You need that sort of direction of travel, and you need to plot some milestones, like you said at the beginning. You need to plan, but everyone reacts differently to change, so we need to be able to understand what we need individually and collectively, and also where we've got blind spots. And in a team, you can maybe balance the blind spots between you. If you're an individual, it's a bit different, but it doesn't mean you can't surround yourself with people who give you that balance, that different perspective as well. So it's all, it's all the same stuff, and it all roots down into who are we, what are we trying to achieve.
But I think that's if that's where you want people to be their authentic selves, don't you? And that's part of the key of the high performing team, isn't it? Of giving people that freedom to be who they are and show up at what they're good at. And so that you have those, the strengths within that team, and let people play to their strengths. And yes, there will be blind spots, but if everybody's playing to their strengths, you know where those spots are. And I guess from an individual point of view, one of the things we look at when we're looking at goals is the internal resources. So things that you have, your skills, your character, your experience that you have, and then where are the gaps for you that you need to look at external resources that can then support you. And it's similar in business as well, isn't it? You've got your resources, and then you've got external resources that you bring in to fill in those blind spots. So, but when you know who's sitting around the table, and from an individual point of view, when you know and you understand who you are and what's important, then you can see where the gaps are, or where you want to put more energy and focus in investing in improving that. So yeah, it's the same challenges, isn't it? Same approach. It's just one's individual and one's from team and business.
Yeah, and I saw that yesterday. I think so. Organisations that really nurture their talent and maximise the energy of their teams.
Yeah.
The divide between them and organisations that don't. COVID has increased that divide. So I think before COVID, it was something like 40% greater impact, where talent and energy is nurtured, and then now it's 50%. So the organisations that were already nurturing their talent and the energy within the business are doing better.
Yeah.
The ones that weren't are doing worse because of COVID.
It's crazy to me. Why would you? I find it very hard to comprehend why you would put so much into recruitment to invest and recruit in the best, and then put them in a cage where they can't be who you've recruited. That doesn't make sense to me, of why you would, you know, clip the wings and not let them be at their best. You've put all of that investment into recruiting the best, to then say, oh no, don't do it like that.
I think that it doesn't make sense at all, but I've seen it happen. I've been in the organisation, you know, and I know why it happens.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make any sense at all. It's probably a topic for another time.
Yeah.
But,
that's it's an interesting debate why that happens, but yeah. And
it's also actually quite easy to resolve it. You know, and some of the businesses I've helped, they've sort of said, oh, we've got this problem. And said, well, that's a symptom, actually. That's not the problem. The problem is because you've got this process which is generating the symptoms. So just if we solve the process and tweak it, you'll get something different popping out and better popping out, you know, which will solve your problem.
Yeah.
I've got one sort of last question for you, which is sort of like a wrap up, I guess, of everything we've touched on. So, you know, we're talking about reviewing goals and reflecting, you know, in a really sort of authentic and a valuable, impactful way. And we know that change is constant. We've touched on VUCA, but we know that change is even more constant, you know, now. If you had one tip, you know, to help people review their goals effectively and reflect, you know, authentically, what would that? I mean, that might not be unfair saying one, but can you go for one? You can have a couple more if you'd like.
People keep coming on here and asking me for one or three, or to sum things up in 60 seconds. And I find it so hard. I think so. One, just me to be really clear on what you're asking. So one tip to help people reflect.
Yeah. So, you know, we've been talking about the need to review goals regularly.
Yeah.
And reflection, you know, can help with that. So if you had one tip for people to do that effectively, what would it be? You can have two, you can have a couple if you like.
No, I mean, we've talked a lot about processes and structure, but I think the one tip is you have to be totally honest. You have to be, none of this will work. So you can put all of the processes in place. You can put something in your diary to sit down every week. You can have a fancy planner and a diary with, you can, all the pictures and everything else. But if you're not honest with yourself and you don't acknowledge what has worked and what hasn't worked and why it hasn't worked, what was the factor of the success or the not success or failure, whichever way you want to look at it, you're not going to move on. You're just going to keep repeating it, because if you're going to put the blame elsewhere and you're going to say, well, that's because somebody else did that, or that's because this happened, if you're going to make excuses, you're not going to move on. So I think my one tip is you've got to put your ego aside, you've got to put some pride aside, and you've got to sit down and be really honest and just say, that didn't work because I did this. And I think even though other people or other things may have played a part in it, if you were there, you had an influence, you played a part in it somehow. And so you have to look at what part you played and where that had influence or whether that controlled what happened. But if, there's no point in sitting down and holding on to ego and pride and putting the blame elsewhere. You've got to sit down and have an honest conversation with yourself to be able to move forward. So that would be my one tip.
I think that's a really good one. I think that's brilliant. And I guess there's something in my mind. I was thinking about the sort of power is in the honesty. Also being honest, with yourself, or getting really honest feedback from other people that, want to help you. There's something quite liberating about that.
Yeah.
As well. So the real power is in the honesty, I guess.
Yeah. And I think for me, it's it reclaims that control, because if you acknowledge the part that you played, you acknowledge the role that you played, or you reflect and accept how you had an influence or control on the outcome, then you can start looking at how you can do that differently. But if you're always putting it elsewhere, or you make excuses, you're just going to end up with that repetition. So I think for real change to happen, you have to be honest about why you've got the outcome that you've got, so that you can start to look at a different way forward.
Yeah, I guess there's something about us accepting, accepting who we are and what we're good at, and not what the things we're not so necessarily good at. So, and that's probably another topic for another day as well.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, what great questions. Well, I wasn't counting. So you said that was your final wrap-up question. So is that
it
all?
There were 5 main ones, and then there were quite a few little sneaky ones that I popped in there along the way.
I don't think anybody has come on with just 5 and not added ones in. And I think that's the value of, I want the extra questions to have, because I think there's so much value in the things that we've talked about today that people can take away and hopefully help themselves. So thank you so much for your time and fantastic questions.
No, I've really enjoyed it. And I think all the things we've touched on, like you said, they're just so important to, as a foundation for people to succeed. If you don't do some of that thinking and think about some of the things we've touched on, you will potentially sort of drift, and nobody really wants that.
No. And I think there's lots of the things that we've talked about today, whether you are an individual working on yourself, whether you are self-employed entrepreneur working on you and your business, or whether you are a business, there's lots of information in there that I think people can take value from. So thank you so much for your time and such great conversation too. I really, really appreciate it.
No, I've enjoyed it, Zoe, and well done.
Thank you very much. So this will be it's on YouTube live now, but it will stay on YouTube. I will also put it out onto Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter. So we will tag you in so people can find you and make contact with you if they have any questions for you. If you are watching back and you have any questions, pop them into the comments box wherever you're watching, and I will answer you and any questions that you have. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Martin, for your time. And we will be back again next week with another guest, another 5 questions, same topic and new conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Martin.